used in New Mexico in May 1950 and have been used on a continuous basis since that time. In the 1950s, anthropomorphic dummies were not widely exposed outside of scientific research circles and easily could have been mistaken for something they were not. Today, anthropomorphic dummies, better known as crash test dummies, are easily identifiable and are even the stars of their own automotive safety advertising campaign. During the 1950s, when the U.S. Air Force dropped the odd-looking test devices from high-altitude balloons in its program to study high-altitude human freefall characteristics, public awareness and stardom were decades away. It seems likely that someone who unexpectedly observed these dummies at a distance would believe they had seen something unusual. In retrospect, when interviewed over 40 years later, they could accurately report that they had seen something very unusual. With the introduction of anthropomorphic dummies as a possible explanation for the reports of bodies, another element of the research profile appeared to be satisfied. Specific information that described the locations, methods, and procedures used to employ the dummies was required before any definitive conclusions could be drawn. To gather this detailed information, research efforts were concentrated on high-altitude balloon operations and the specific projects that utilized balloon-borne anthropomorphic dummies. Test dummies used by the U.S. Air Force. Since the beginning of manned flight, designers have sought a substitute for the human body to test hazardous new equipment. Early devices used by the predecessors of the U.S. Air Force were simply constructed parachute drop test dummies with little similarity to the human form. Following World War II, aircraft emergency escape systems became increasingly sophisticated, and engineers required a dummy with more human-like characteristics. Parachute drop dummies. During World War I, research and development of the first U.S. military parachute was underway at McCook Field, Ohio. To test the parachute, engineers experimented with several types of dummies, settling on a model constructed of 3-inch hemp rope and sandbags with the approximate proportions of a medium-sized man. The new invention was soon known by the nickname Dummy Joe. Dummy Joe is said to have made more than 5,000 jumps between 1918 and 1924. By 1924, parachutes were required on military aircraft with their serviceability tested by dummies dropped from aircraft. For this routine testing, several types of dummies were used. The most common type is shown in figures 17 and 18. Parachutes were individually drop tested from aircraft until the early stages of World War II, when due to both increased reliability and large numbers of parachutes in service, this routine practice was discontinued. Nonetheless, test dummies were still used frequently by the Parachute Branch of Air Materiel Command, AMC, at Wright Field, Ohio, to test new parachute designs. Anthropomorphic dummies. The ejection seat had been developed and used successfully by the German Luftwaffe during the later stages of World War II. The utility of this invention was realized when the U.S. Army Air Forces obtained an ejection seat in 1944. To properly test the ejection seat, the Army Air Forces required a dummy that had the same center of gravity and weight distribution as a human, characteristics that parachute drop dummies did not possess. In 1944, the U.S. Army Air Force Air Materiel Command contracted with the Ted Smith Company of Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, to accurately represent a human. The dummy had the same basic shape as a human, but with only abstract human features and skin made of canvas. In 1949, the U.S. Air Force Aeromedical Laboratory submitted a proposal for an improved model of the anthropomorphic dummy. This request was originated by the renowned Air Force scientist and physician John P. Stapp, now a retired colonel, who conducted a series of landmark experiments at Muroc, now Edwards Air Force Base, California, to measure the effects of acceleration and deceleration during high-speed aircraft ejections. Stapp required a dummy that had the same center of gravity and articulation as a human, but, unlike the Ted Smith dummy, was more human in appearance. A more accurate external appearance was required to provide for the proper fit of helmets, oxygen masks, and other equipment used during the tests. Staff requested the anthropology branch of the Aeromedical Laboratory at Wright Field to review anthropological, orthopedic, and engineering literature to prepare specifications for the new dummy. Plaster casts of the torso, legs, and arms of an Air Force pilot were also taken to assure accuracy. The result was a proposed dummy that stood 72 inches tall, weighed 200 pounds, had provisions for mounting instrumentation, and could withstand up to 100 times the force of gravity, or 100 Gs. In 1949, a contract was awarded to Sierra Engineering Company of Sierra Madre, California, and deliveries began in 1950. This dummy quickly became known as Sierra Sam. In 1952, a contract for anthropomorphic dummies was awarded to Alderson Research Laboratories Incorporated of New York City. Dummies constructed by both companies possess the same basic characteristics: a skeleton of aluminum or steel, latex or plastic skin, a cast aluminum skull, and an instrument cavity in the torso and head for the mounting of strain gauges, accelerometers, transducers, and rate gyros. Models used by the Air Force were primarily parachute drop and ejection seat versions with center of gravity tolerances within 1/4 inch. Over the next several years, the two companies improved and redesigned internal structures and instrumentation, but the basic external appearance of the dummies remained relatively constant from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s. Dummies of these types were most likely the aliens associated with the Roswell incident. End of Section 1. Recording by Aaron Bennett. Section 2 of the Roswell Report, Case Closed, by James McAndrew. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Aaron Bennett. The Roswell Report, Case Closed, by James McAndrew. High-altitude balloon dummy drops. Section 1.2. High-altitude balloon dummy drops. From 1953 to 1959, anthropomorphic dummies were used by the U.S. Air Force Aeromedical Laboratory as part of the high-altitude aircraft escape projects High Dive and Excelsior. The object of these studies was to devise a method to return a pilot or astronaut to Earth by parachute if forced to escape at extreme altitudes. Anthropomorphic dummies were transported to altitudes up to 98,000 feet by high-altitude balloons. The dummies were then released for a period of free fall while body movements and escape equipment performance were recorded by a variety of instruments. 43 high-altitude balloon flights carrying 67 anthropomorphic dummies were launched and recovered throughout New Mexico between June 1954 and February 1959. Due to prevailing wind conditions, operational factors, and ruggedness of the terrain, the majority of dummies impacted outside the confines of military reservations in eastern New Mexico, near Roswell, and in areas surrounding the Tularosa Valley in south-central New Mexico. Additionally, 30 dummies were dropped by aircraft over White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico in 1953. In 1959, 150 dummies were dropped by aircraft over Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, possibly accounting for alleged alien sightings at that location. A number of these launch and recovery locations were in the areas where the crash saucer and space aliens were allegedly observed. Following the series of dummy tests, a human subject, test pilot Captain Joseph W. Kittinger, Jr., now a retired colonel, made 3 parachute jumps from high-altitude balloons. Since freefall tests from these unprecedented altitudes were extremely hazardous, they could not be accomplished by a human until a rigorous testing program using anthropomorphic dummies was completed. A cover-up? Countering claims of a cover-up, Air Force projects that used anthropomorphic dummies and human subjects were unclassified and widely publicized in numerous newspaper and magazine stories, books, and television reports. These included a book written by test pilot Kittinger, The Long, Lonely Leap, Another book, Man High, by Man High project scientist Lieutenant Colonel David G. Simons, MC, a feature article in National Geographic, and cover stories in Life, Collier's, Popular Mechanics, and Time. A characterization of Kittinger's record parachute jump even appeared in the adolescent magazine Mad. The intense public interest in high dive, Excelsior, and other aeromedical projects conducted at Holloman Air Force Base also resulted in a 1956 20th Century Fox full-length motion picture, On the Threshold of Space. Dummy drop procedures. For the majority of the tests, dummies were flown to altitudes between 30,000 and 98,000 feet, attached to a specially designed rack suspended below a high-altitude balloon. On several flights, the dummies were mounted in the door of Upon reaching the desired altitude, the dummies were released and free fell for several minutes before deployment of the main parachute. The dummies used for the balloon drops were outfitted with standard equipment of an Air Force air crew member. This equipment consisted of a one-piece flight suit, olive drab, gray. Witnesses had described seeing aliens in gray one-piece suits, or fuchsia in color, boots, and a parachute pack. The dummies were also fitted with an instrumentation kit that contained accelerometers, pressure transducers, an oscillograph, and a camera to record movements of the dummy during freefall. Recoveries of the test dummies were accomplished by personnel from the Holloman Air Force Base Balloon Branch. Typically, 8 to 12 civilian and military recovery personnel arrived at the site of an anthropomorphic dummy landing as soon as possible following impact. The recovery crews operated a variety of aircraft and vehicles. These included a wrecker, a 6x6, a weapons carrier, and L-20 observation and C-47 transport aircraft. The exact vehicles and aircraft described by the witnesses as having been present at the crash saucer locations. On one occasion, just southwest of Roswell, a high dive project officer, First Lieutenant Raymond A. Madsen, even conducted a search for dummies on horseback. To expedite the recoveries, crews were pre-positioned with their vehicles along the paved highway in the area where impact was expected. On a typical flight, the dummies were separated from the balloon by radio command and descended by parachute. Prompt recovery of the dummies and their suspension racks, which usually did not land in the same location, resulting in extensive ground and air searches, was essential for researchers to evaluate information collected by the instrumentation and camera. To assist the recovery personnel, a variety of methods were used to enhance the visibility of the dummies. Smoke grenades, pigment powder, and brightly colored parachute canopies. Also, recovery notices promising a $25 reward were taped to an exposed portion of a dummy. Local newspapers and radio stations were contacted when equipment was lost. Despite these efforts, the dummies were not always recovered immediately. One was not found for nearly 3 years, and several were not recovered at all. When they were found, the dummies and instrumentation were often damaged from impact. Damage to the dummies included loss of heads, arms, legs, and fingers. This detail, dummies with missing fingers, appears to satisfy another element of the research profile, aliens with only 4 fingers. What may have contributed to a misunderstanding if the dummies were viewed by persons unfamiliar with their intended use were the methods used by Holloman Air Force Base personnel to transport them. The dummies were sometimes transported to and from off-range locations in wooden shipping containers, similar to caskets, to prevent damage to fragile instruments mounted in and on the dummy.